Biography Nostradamus, A Life in Prophecy. The Prophet of Doom documentary. Who was the man behind the mysterious verses that seemed to predict the future? From the shadowy streets of 16th century France to the courts of kings and queens, Nostradamus left behind a legacy that still echoes today. In this documentary, uncover the life, secrets, and prophecies of one of history's most enigmatic figures. Welcome. I'm William. Don't forget to subscribe. It really helps us a lot. Thank you. Birth and early life, 1503–1519. Michael de Nostradam was born on either December 14th or 21, 1503, in the small town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, located in the region of Provence in southern France. At the time, France was under the rule of King Louis XIV of the Valois dynasty, and the country was slowly recovering from the prolonged impact of the Hundred Years' War. Saint-Rémy, nestled in the foothills of the Alpilles mountain range, was a modest yet historically rich community influenced by Roman and medieval legacies. The town's architectural landscape featured narrow stone streets, modest townhouses, and ancient remnants like the Glanum ruins nearby, reminders of the region's complex past that blended Roman, Christian, and Jewish presences. Michel's family came from Jewish heritage, bearing the original surname Gassonnet. His grandfather, Guy Gassonnet, had converted to Roman Catholicism in the late 15th century, during a period of heightened anti-Jewish sentiment in southern France. As part of the conversion process, the family adopted the new surname de Nostradam, a Latinized name likely referencing the Virgin Mary, Notre Dame. This was a strategic move in an era when public conversion to Christianity was not only expected but often demanded for professional or social advancement. Michel's father, Jaume de Nostradam, was a notary and a grain and goods merchant, a respected role that positioned the family within the emerging middle class. His mother, Brenière de Saint-Rémy, was from a well-established Provençal family with local roots and some affluence. Their household valued learning, faith, and social propriety, and they maintained connections with both the merchant class and the remnants of local nobility. A pivotal influence in Michel's early intellectual life was his maternal grandfather, Jean de Saint-Rémy. Jean was a man of education and perhaps some occult or medical knowledge, though direct documentation is sparse. He is believed to have introduced the young Michel to a variety of classical subjects: Latin, Greek, mathematics, astronomy, astrology, and the rudiments of herbal medicine. This early education was eclectic, typical of Renaissance humanism, which sought to reconcile empirical observation with spiritual understanding. For a boy growing up in a conservative Catholic kingdom that was both wary of heresy and fascinated by mysticism, this upbringing planted the seeds for Michel's later transformation into Nostradamus. During the early 1500s, the region of Provence was culturally distinct from northern France. It had closer ties to Mediterranean customs and languages, particularly the Provençal dialect, and was shaped by centuries of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic intellectual exchange through trade and conquest. Yet, beneath the surface, religious tensions simmered. Jews who had not converted were expelled in waves, and even converted families like the Nostradams lived under social suspicion. These dynamics would shape Michel's cautious public persona, and perhaps explain his later use of coded language and cryptic writing styles. The French monarchy under Louis XIV maintained relative stability during Michel's childhood, but the kingdom was far from peaceful. War with Italy, papal conflicts, and dynastic ambitions created an atmosphere of shifting alliances and instability. The Renaissance was blooming in Italy, and its influence was creeping into French intellectual life. These were the conditions under which Michel de Nostradam came of age, conditions that nurtured both curiosity and caution, ambition and secrecy. 2. Education and the Plague Years, 1519–1529. At the age of 15, in the year 1519, Michel de Nostradam enrolled at the University of Avignon, a regional center for learning with a strong tradition in liberal arts. There, he began formal studies in grammar, rhetoric, logic, and basic sciences, following the typical academic curriculum of the time for aspiring scholars and clerics. The university operated under the patronage of the Catholic Church, which controlled access to knowledge, particularly in theology and medicine. Despite this structure, Avignon was known for tolerating some diversity of thought due to its historical status as a papal enclave. However, Michel's education at Avignon was cut short after only a year. In 1520, an outbreak of the bubonic plague forced the closure of the university. The epidemic, part of a larger series of recurrences since the Black Death of the 14th century, devastated towns and rural communities throughout southern France. This personal encounter with mass death and medical helplessness left a lasting impression on Michel. Faced with the collapse of formal institutions, he pivoted away from academic study and entered what would become a defining phase of his life: first-hand work in combating the plague. From roughly 1520 to 1528, Michel traveled through the countryside of Provence, Languedoc, and Gascony, working as an apothecary. Although the profession was considered a manual trade and not fully accepted by university-trained physicians, apothecaries held essential roles in communities, preparing and dispensing herbal remedies and maintaining collections of medicinal plants. Over these years, Michel built practical knowledge in the use of botanical treatments and hygiene strategies, earning local acclaim for his efforts to treat those afflicted by plague symptoms, swellings, fever, vomiting, and often death. 1. Of the critical distinctions in Michel's approach was his deviation from mainstream medical doctrine, which still clung to the outdated teachings of Galen and Hippocrates. While most physicians adhered to bloodletting, purging, and humoral theory, Michel promoted basic cleanliness, clean air, low-salt diets, and the use of natural antiseptics like rose hips. He also observed patterns in the disease's spread that hinted at early epidemiological thinking, although his insights would not be formalized for centuries. Despite the respect he earned in the field, Michel sought to resume formal education in medicine, aiming to elevate his status from apothecary to physician. In 1529, he gained admission to the University of Montpellier, one of the most prestigious medical schools in Europe. Montpellier had a long history of combining empirical medical practice with theoretical instruction, and was known for integrating knowledge from Greek, Roman, Arabic, and Jewish sources. For Michel, this represented an opportunity to legitimize his experience and join the ranks of the educated elite. Yet his enrollment at Montpellier was short-lived. A few months into his studies, he was expelled from the university upon the discovery of his past as an apothecary. At the time, university statutes prohibited manual laborers, considered socially inferior and intellectually unfit, from earning medical degrees. This rigid class boundary, rooted in medieval academic elitism, barred Michel from advancing within institutional medicine. The university's action reflected the broader divide between learned physicians, who followed scholastic rules, and practical healers, who relied on experience and experimentation. This rejection left Michel disillusioned with the academic establishment, but did not end his pursuit of knowledge. Instead, it pushed him further into independent study and informal networks of learning, including correspondence with other healers and thinkers across southern France and northern Italy. It was also during this time that Michel began to integrate his medical practice with a growing interest in astrology and ancient philosophical texts, seeing connections between cosmic rhythms and human health. His experience in Montpellier, a place of great promise followed by exclusion, would reinforce his tendency toward intellectual independence, secrecy, and a hybrid worldview that combined science, mysticism, and observation. Brie, rise as a plague doctor and herbal healer, 1530–1534. After his expulsion from the University of Montpellier, Michel de Nostradame returned to practicing medicine with renewed determination and a sharper sense of independence. The early 1530s were marked by successive outbreaks of the plague throughout southern France, and his services were in immediate demand. During these years, he worked in cities like Agen and Aix-en-Provence, two urban centers that had experienced high mortality rates and were desperate for effective treatment. In these cities, Michel's unconventional methods distinguished him from other practitioners. Unlike the majority of physicians, who still adhered strictly to humoral theory and prescribed purging, bleeding, or the use of mercury-based compounds, Michel emphasized preventive care, environmental cleanliness, and diet. He advised the use of fresh air, burned aromatic woods to disinfect homes, and recommended boiled water mixed with herbs and fruit to cleanse the body. His herbal arsenal included rose hips, which are rich in vitamin C, thyme for its antiseptic qualities, and wormwood as a tonic. He prepared poultices and decoctions using local plants, many of which were part of ancient Mediterranean herbal traditions. Michel's emphasis on practical, observation-based medicine earned him both local admiration and professional criticism. Patients and communities welcomed his hands-on approach and the personal risk he undertook by remaining in plague-infected areas. Meanwhile, traditional physicians viewed his work with skepticism or outright disdain, partly because he lacked a university degree, and partly because his methods often exposed the inadequacies of their own. He often traveled between towns with a small team of assistants carrying his own tools and supplies, including surgical instruments, dried herbs, and what might now be considered rudimentary personal protective gear, such as gloves and perfumed cloths used to cover the nose and mouth. While these practices might seem unsophisticated by today's standards, they reflected a remarkable level of hygiene awareness for the 16th century and anticipated principles that would later become central to public health. Beyond his medical reputation, Michel also began to develop a profile as a thinker and problem solver. In Aix, he reportedly contributed to urban planning discussions related to sanitation and pest control. His practical recommendations on waste management, ventilation, and the placement of plague hospitals indicated a broader vision of health, one that recognized the environment's role in disease transmission. These ideas, although never formally codified into public policy during his time, influenced how some local leaders responded to health crises in the decades that followed. His work as a plague doctor also deepened his philosophical outlook. Confronting daily death and suffering in large numbers seemed to transform him from a practical healer into a man obsessed with the deeper patterns of life and fate. He began to study classical medical texts more closely, Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna, but with a new lens, one that searched not just for cures but for underlying cosmic order. He began to view disease not only as a physical affliction, but as a signal of celestial imbalance or divine intervention. These formative years forged the dual identity that would come to define him: Michel the doctor and Nostradamus the seer. It was during this time that he first began signing some of his correspondence with the Latinized version of his name, indicating a subtle but intentional shift in how he viewed himself. As his reputation grew, so did the mythos surrounding him, and whispers began to circulate about his ability to predict the future. Though these claims were premature at this stage, they hinted at a reputation that was beginning to extend beyond the realm of medicine. In this chapter of his life, Nostradamus operated at the intersection of empirical practice and intuitive insight. He did not belong to any formal medical institution, nor was he yet part of any recognized mystical order. He was, instead, a bridge between worlds, a man of the Renaissance who embraced both observation and symbolism, practicality and prophecy. His success as a healer in this period laid the groundwork for the prophetic career that would soon follow, giving him the public credibility and personal confidence to explore ideas that others feared or dismissed. Personal tragedy and transformation, 1534–1538. In the mid-1530s, Michel de Nostradame experienced a period of personal devastation that would alter the course of his life permanently. By 1534, he had established himself in the city of Agen, located in the region of Guyenne in southwestern France. There, he married a young woman whose name remains lost to history. Some later sources suggest she may have come from a well-to-do family, but concrete records are scarce. The marriage produced 2 children and brought Michel a sense of stability after years of itinerant work and the hardships of plague medicine. However, the security he found in Agen proved tragically short-lived. In 1534 or 1535, another outbreak of the plague swept through the region, striking with speed and cruelty. Despite all his experience, knowledge, and efforts, Michel was unable to save his wife or children. They succumbed to the disease, most likely within days of one another. Their deaths shattered him. Accounts from this time suggest a profound grief that affected not only his emotional life, but also his sense of identity and purpose. The psychological impact of the loss cannot be overstated. Having dedicated years to healing the sick and developing methods to reduce mortality, Michel faced the brutal reality of his own limitations. The same man who had been praised for his ingenuity and bravery in other towns could not protect his own family. This failure, unfair though it was, haunted him. He withdrew from public life and turned inward, questioning not only the science of medicine, but the nature of fate, divine will, and the human capacity for understanding suffering. Adding to this pain was a growing threat from ecclesiastical authorities. Rumors had begun to circulate that Michel harbored heretical ideas, or that his methods bordered on witchcraft. In part, these suspicions were fueled by his use of astrology, a practice increasingly associated with forbidden knowledge. Though astrology had long been tolerated, even consulted by members of the nobility and clergy, it remained officially condemned when it veered into determinism or challenged church doctrine. Michel's medical practices, which often contradicted accepted academic norms, made him an easy target. The Inquisition was particularly active in regions where religious orthodoxy was seen as under threat. In 1537, Michel was formally summoned by inquisitorial officials for questioning. While there is no definitive record of the exact charges, the nature of the Inquisition at the time suggests they could have included accusations of unlicensed medical practice, the use of magical or astrological arts, or deviations from Catholic doctrine. Whether through political connections, lack of evidence, or sheer fortune, he avoided prosecution. But the episode made it clear that his presence in Agen was no longer tenable. He left the city under a cloud of suspicion and sorrow, beginning several years of wandering throughout France and possibly parts of northern Italy. During this time, he visited cities such as Lyon, Marseille, and possibly Florence or Milan. While many of his movements remain undocumented, various letters and local accounts confirm that he remained intellectually active. He visited libraries, consulted with other scholars, and likely began collecting the source materials that would inform his later writings. Freed from the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood, but also marked by the loss, Michael's intellectual focus shifted. He turned more fully to esoteric studies, including alchemy, mystical theology, and the works of ancient prophets. He read widely in classical literature, including Livy, Suetonius, and Pliny the Elder, but also consulted Jewish Kabbalistic texts and medieval grimoires. His exposure to different traditions deepened his belief that history followed discernible cycles, and that certain events, wars, plagues, revolutions, could be traced to celestial alignments or encoded in sacred texts. Was in this emotional and intellectual crucible that the seeds of Les Prophéties were planted. Though he had not yet begun to write the prophetic verses that would make him famous, the structure of his thought was forming. He began to see the world not just as a physician seeking causes and cures, but as a visionary attempting to read the cosmic script behind the veil of daily life. This transformation would not have been possible without the profound losses he suffered during this period. His grief did not silence him, it redirected him. It moved him from healing bodies to attempting to interpret destiny. The death of his wife and children, combined with exile and accusation, initiated a new phase in Michel's life, one of retreat, study, and eventual reinvention. It was this transformation that would lead him, within a decade, to the small town of Salon de Provence, where the man known as Nostradamus would fully emerge. 5. Rebirth in Salon de Provence and second marriage, 1547–1554. By the late 1540s, Michel de Nostredame had resettled in Salon de Provence, a fortified town located along the Durance River in southeastern France. The town, with its cobbled streets, robust market culture, and proximity to Marseille and Avignon, offered Michel both relative seclusion and intellectual stimulation. After years of wandering, loss, and persecution, Salon became a sanctuary, a place where he could rebuild his life, marry again, raise a family, and immerse himself in a new and evolving intellectual vocation. In 1547, he married Anne Ponsard, a wealthy widow whose family owned a profitable candied fruit business. The marriage provided financial stability and social standing. Anne was not only economically independent, but reportedly supportive of Michel's wide-ranging interests, including his growing preoccupation with astrology, astronomy, and the occult. The couple went on to have 6 children, 3 daughters and 3 sons, establishing a household that would eventually become a multi-generational legacy tied to the Nostredame name. Their home in Salon de Provence, now a historical museum, became both a family residence and a center for Michel's intellectual pursuits. He began collecting rare books, ancient manuscripts, medical treatises, and astrological charts. His personal library, by all accounts, was impressive for its time and region. Among its holdings were volumes of classical philosophy, Jewish mysticism, early Christian apocalyptic texts, and translations of Arabic and Greek scientific works. Michel read deeply from the Corpus Hermeticum, a series of texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus that emphasized hidden knowledge, divine order, and the cyclical nature of time. These themes would later underpin the structure of his own writings. At the same time, he maintained a modest medical practice, attending to local patients and advising nearby nobles. However, his public focus was gradually shifting away from medicine. The plague outbreaks of earlier decades had receded, and his role as a healer was no longer his defining feature. Instead, he became known locally for his horoscopes and astrological analyses, which he crafted using a combination of star charts, planetary tables, and historical patterns. He studied planetary conjunctions with meticulous care, often cross-referencing them with biblical prophecy and medieval eschatology. The atmosphere of mid-16th century France, under King Henry II, was volatile and uncertain. Religious tensions between Catholics and emerging Protestant sects were deepening. Peasant revolts, court intrigues, and external wars with the Holy Roman Empire and Spain created an air of instability. Many intellectuals of the time, including Michel, interpreted this unrest as evidence of an impending period of upheaval and transformation. For Michel, the signs were not merely political or social, they were cosmic. He came to believe that the alignment of stars and planets could reflect divine messages about the fate of humanity. During these years, Michel also began experimenting with various tools of divination. Historical accounts and letters suggest he practiced forms of scrying, a method in which a reflective surface, such as a bowl of water or a polished metal plate, is used to induce trance-like visions. While modern historians debate the veracity or literal accuracy of these reports, they reflect Michel's deepening engagement with symbolic systems of interpretation. He was no longer merely reading books or tracking celestial bodies. He was trying to decode patterns he believed were woven into the fabric of time itself. His isolation in Salon de Provence was strategic. Though he maintained correspondence with scholars in Avignon, Lyon, and even northern Italy, he remained physically removed from major centers of religious and academic authority. This distance allowed him to write more freely, to develop new ideas, and to test the boundaries of acceptable discourse without immediate threat from the Inquisition or royal censors. He used Latin and Provençal in his correspondence and personal notes, further shielding his work from casual scrutiny. By the early 1550s, Michel was preparing to put his thoughts into a form that could be published and shared. He had begun writing in poetic quatrains, a structure that offered both stylistic elegance and interpretive ambiguity. Each verse, composed of 4 rhymed lines, could encapsulate a symbolic vision or historical pattern without offering specific details that could attract condemnation or be disproved. He mixed languages, concealed dates, and layered meanings, partly for safety and partly because he believed truth itself was never fully literal. In this period, Michel de Nostredame evolved from a plague doctor into a prophet poet. While still seen by some in Ceylon as a physician and respected town elder, he was becoming something more enigmatic, a man who claimed no divine inspiration yet sought to reveal divine order, a scholar who rejected superstition yet studied omens and signs, a Catholic in practice but deeply influenced by Jewish mysticism and Greek metaphysics. He was in every sense a Renaissance figure, synthesizing multiple traditions, disciplines, and identities into a new form of knowledge. His life in Salon de Provence, quiet, secure, and intellectually fertile, was the calm before a storm. Within a few years, he would publish Les Prophéties, a work that would carry his name far beyond the borders of France and across centuries of human history. 6. The publication of the Prophecies, 1555. In 1555, Michel de Nostredame took a decisive and irreversible step in his transformation from provincial scholar to international figure by publishing the first edition of Les Prophéties. The book was a collection of 353 quatrains, 4-line poems, written in an intentionally obscure and symbolic style. It was unlike anything else circulating in the European book trade at the time. Though framed as prophetic utterances, the quatrains were deeply rooted in historical cycles, astrological alignments, and esoteric traditions, blending poetic elegance with coded warnings. The book was published in Lyon, a major hub for printing and intellectual exchange in Renaissance France. The publisher, Massé Bonhomme, recognized the market potential for such a mysterious and provocative work, especially in an era marked by fear of war, religious conflict, and political instability. The mid-16th century was awash with apocalyptic literature, sermons predicting the end times, treatises on comets and eclipses, and pamphlets speculating about the Antichrist. Les Prophéties entered this landscape not as fringe mysticism, but as a sophisticated literary artifact that appeared to bridge the divine and the empirical. The style of the quatrains was as much a protective mechanism as a literary device. Nostradamus mixed French with Latin, Greek, and Provençal, sometimes within the same stanza. He obscured names through anagrams, employed wordplay, and alluded to classical mythology and biblical scripture. The result was a text that resisted straightforward interpretation. This ambiguity served multiple functions. It gave the prophecies a sense of timelessness, allowed readers to project meanings based on current events, and most importantly, shielded Nostradamus from accusations of heresy or political sedition. Though Les Prophéties was marketed as predictions, its true nature was closer to historical pattern recognition. Nostradamus believed that time moved in cycles, and that events repeated themselves in altered forms, governed by celestial configurations and divine will. Each quatrain, therefore, was less a prediction of a singular future event and more a poetic rendering of probable outcomes based on past occurrences and planetary alignments. His references often drew from classical history, the Old Testament, and medieval chronicles. He layered metaphor upon metaphor, invoking lions, eagles, great kings, and black skies in ways that made his verses applicable to multiple contexts and eras. The initial public reaction was a mixture of fascination, confusion, and fear. Educated readers and nobles saw in the work a sophisticated literary puzzle. Some praised it as a bold attempt to synthesize history, astrology, and theology. Others dismissed it as cryptic nonsense or dangerous superstition. Among the general population, however, the book fed into widespread anxieties about war, plague, famine, and divine judgment. The notion that a single man might possess insights into such cataclysmic events elevated Nostradamus to a near-mythical status. At the time of the book's publication, France was under the rule of King Henry II, and tensions between Catholic and emerging Protestant factions were on the rise. Nostradamus carefully avoided direct commentary on religion or politics in his published works. Still, some readers believed they could find allusions to current events in his verses. Whispers circulated that he had predicted the fall of great cities, the deaths of monarchs, and the rise of new powers. His reputation as a prophet, though he never claimed that title himself, began to solidify. The success of the 1555 edition prompted him to begin work on expanded volumes almost immediately. He revised some of the quatrains, added annotations in his personal manuscripts, and composed new verses that would eventually bring the total number to 942. He continued to write late into the night, often consulting astrological charts and classical texts by candlelight, committed to the idea that beneath the chaos of human affairs lay a hidden structure. It is worth noting that while Les Prophéties was his most famous work, it was not his only publication. Around the same time, Nostradamus published Traité des Fardements et Confitures, a treatise on cosmetics, hygiene, and fruit preservation, demonstrating his continued interest in practical science and medicine. But it was the prophecies that captured the imagination of the public and elevated him from respected doctor to something more enigmatic. In the cultural context of the mid-1500s, the idea that a mortal man could read the signs of the heavens and reveal the fates of nations held both allure and danger. Printing had made it possible for such ideas to spread widely, and Les Prophéties became one of the earliest bestsellers of the French Renaissance. Its language, though cloaked in metaphor, resonated with readers across social classes. For the literate elite, it offered intellectual challenge. For the common reader, it provided warnings and wonder. By the end of 1555, Nostradamus was no longer merely a provincial physician or an eccentric scholar. He was now a public figure whose writings would be interpreted, debated, and feared. His identity, once grounded in science and healing, had merged with the persona of the prophet-poet. This transformation brought him not only fame, but also the attention of powerful patrons who would draw him into the highest circles of French political life. 7. Patronage of Catherine de' Medici and royal favor, 1556-1564. In 1556, just a year after the publication of Les Prophéties, Nostradamus attracted the attention of one of the most powerful and politically astute figures in Europe, Queen Catherine de' Medici. The Italian-born wife of King Henry II of France, Catherine was deeply concerned about the fate of her family and her kingdom, both of which were increasingly entangled in religious conflict and court intrigue. A patron of the arts, sciences, and mystical traditions, she had a well-documented interest in astrology and frequently consulted horoscopes and oracles. It was within this context that she summoned Nostradamus to the royal court. The invitation was both a validation and a test. For a man of his background, non-noble, recently controversial, and self-taught in many disciplines, being called to court could elevate his status or place him in extreme danger. When Nostradamus arrived in Paris, he was granted an audience with the Queen, who reportedly requested horoscopes for each of her children, including the young princes who would later become Charles IX and Henry III. These astrological charts required precise birth times, planetary positions, and careful interpretation, tasks for which Nostradamus had spent years preparing in his private studies. Catherine was especially intrigued by quatrains that seemed to foretell the death of her husband, King Henry II. One prophecy in particular, later numbered Century 1, Quatrain 35 reads, "The young lion shall overcome the older one. On the field of combat in a single battle, he will pierce his eyes through a golden cage. 2 wounds made one. Then he dies a cruel death." In 1559, 4 years after the initial publication of the quatrains, King Henry II participated in a jousting tournament to celebrate the marriage of his daughter Elizabeth of Valois to Philip II of Spain. During a match with Gabriel, Comte de Montgomery, the king was struck in the eye by a splintered lance that entered through the slit in his golden helmet. Despite the best efforts of court physicians, he died 10 days later in agony. A death that eerily echoed the lines of Nostradamus's quatrain. The accuracy of the prophecy, as interpreted by the royal court, solidified Nostradamus's reputation as a man of vision. Catherine de' Medici was both impressed and disturbed by the apparent foresight, and her interest in his writings deepened. From that point forward, Nostradamus enjoyed a level of protection and prestige that shielded him from the church's scrutiny and gave him access to influential patrons. He was appointed counselor and physician in ordinary to the king by Charles IX, Catherine's son, when the boy ascended the throne in 1560. This period marked the peak of Nostradamus's public influence. He traveled periodically to court, but remained based in Salon de Provence, where he continued to write and practice medicine. The endorsement of the monarchy gave him legitimacy in the eyes of the nobility and allowed him to publish new editions of Les Prophéties without fear of censorship or arrest. His earlier concerns about persecution had not been unfounded. Astrologers and mystics had been executed for less, but royal favor offered a unique immunity. Within the court, Nostradamus occupied an ambiguous position. He was admired as a prophet, but also regarded with suspicion by traditionalists and theologians. Some dismissed his writings as poetic guesswork, while others feared the political implications of his predictions. His relationship with Catherine, however, remained strong. She saw in him not only a prophet but a counselor capable of offering guidance during a time of political fragility. Her reign was overshadowed by the growing threat of religious civil war, and she often turned to occult and esoteric knowledge for insight into how to manage her fracturing kingdom. During these years, Nostradamus also expanded his correspondence with European nobles and scholars. Letters from the period indicate that he was consulted on a wide range of topics: health, succession, foreign policy, and celestial events. He composed personalized prophecies for aristocratic clients, many of which were not published but circulated privately. These commissions increased his wealth and allowed him to further invest in his personal library and collection of astronomical instruments. Despite his increasing fame, Nostradamus remained careful. He never claimed to possess supernatural powers or divine inspiration. Instead, he described his work as a synthesis of natural science, historical analysis, and divine timing, guided by astrology and biblical allegory. His rhetorical caution was intentional. In a time when the church wielded enormous power, any suggestion of clairvoyance or communication with spirits could have led to accusations of witchcraft or heresy. The patronage of Catherine de' Medici was a double-edged sword. It brought him influence, wealth, and protection, but also placed his work under constant scrutiny. He was now a man whose words could sway royal opinion, whose verses could be interpreted as omens of disaster or divine messages. Every line he wrote was read not only by scholars and mystics but by politicians and enemies. He had become a public figure whose vision was feared as much as it was revered. Between 1556 and 1564, Michel de Nostradam, now firmly known to the world as Nostradamus, moved fully into his role as a chronicler of potential futures. His life had shifted from healing the sick to advising rulers, from decoding symptoms of illness to deciphering the signs of history. In the royal court of France, where ambition, anxiety, and faith mingled with danger, Nostradamus had become both a trusted voice and a man whose every word might foretell the fate of empires. The later prophecies and political intrigue, 1564–1566. In the final years of his life, Nostradamus entered a phase of prolific literary activity and sharpened political awareness. By 1564, he had already earned fame across France and parts of Europe, but his work was far from finished. He turned again to Les Prophéties, determined to expand it and refine his vision. He added hundreds of new quatrains to the original volume, bringing the total closer to 1,000. These additions would form the foundation of the 1558 and posthumously published 1568 editions, which were assembled by his son César de Nostradam and others after Michel's death. The tone of the later prophecies was darker, more complex, and less constrained by the political caution of earlier years. Many of the quatrains appear to refer to future upheavals far beyond his own era: conflagrations, assassinations, tyrants, invasions, and environmental disasters. While specific dates were rarely included, many quatrains contained veiled references to astronomical events or historical analogies that allowed later interpreters to match them with modern crises: revolutions, world wars, totalitarian regimes, and terrorist attacks. Critics accused Nostradamus of vagueness, but his defenders argued that such language was necessary in a world where too much precision could bring lethal consequences. As religious violence escalated in France, Nostradamus observed the growing divide between Catholics and Huguenots with increasing alarm. The French wars of religion were beginning to consume the country. Though he avoided direct commentary, his prophecies reflect the apocalyptic mood of the time. References to the blood of the righteous, cities consumed by flame, and two suns in the sky captured a collective fear that civilization was on the brink of collapse. Readers from both sides of the conflict claimed his support, interpreting his verses in ways that suited their cause. One of the most persistent myths surrounding Nostradamus's later writings is that he foresaw not only events of his own century, but those far in the future. Modern enthusiasts have linked specific quatrains to figures such as Napoleon Bonaparte, Adolf Hitler, and even the attacks of September 11, 2001. A frequently cited example is Century 2. Quatrain 24, "Beasts ferocious with hunger will cross the Ouida rivers. The greater part of the battlefield will be against Hister. Into a cage of iron will the Great One be drawn, when the child of Germany observes nothing." Many have pointed to Hister as a cryptic reference to Hitler, despite the fact that Hister was a classical name for the lower Danube River. Skeptics argue that such interpretations are projections, the result of confirmation bias and selective reading. But believers insist that the breadth and resonance of the quatrains transcend coincidence. While Nostradamus never claimed to be a prophet in the biblical sense, he believed that historical cycles and celestial patterns could provide meaningful glimpses into the future. He viewed his role not as a magician, but as a scholar deciphering divine and natural signs. His method was rooted in the Renaissance concept of Prisca Theologia, the belief in an ancient, unified truth accessible through study of the earliest sources, including astrology, the Kabbalah, and classical philosophy. The growing demand for his work in courtly and public circles meant that his writings were often copied and circulated beyond his control. Unauthorized editions began to appear, sometimes with interpolated quatrains or altered lines that changed the meaning of the originals. These distortions contributed to both his fame and the controversies that surrounded him. They also made it increasingly difficult to separate Nostradamus's authentic voice from the interpretations, additions, and fabrications of others. During these final years, Nostradamus also dealt with declining health. He suffered from chronic gout, a condition that caused excruciating pain and made it difficult for him to walk or write for long periods. Eventually, the illness led to edema and signs of congestive heart failure. Despite this, he remained intellectually active. He continued to write, correspond, and receive visitors, including nobles and clergy seeking advice or clarification on his published works. In 1564, King Charles IX and Queen Catherine de' Medici made a royal progress through the provinces of France, a political and symbolic journey intended to reinforce the authority of the crown in an increasingly divided nation. When the royal procession reached Salon de Provence, Nostradamus was among the dignitaries invited to receive them. Despite his deteriorating condition, he welcomed the royal entourage and was formally honored by the crown. The visit was a public acknowledgement of his status as both a man of science and a figure of national importance. That recognition, however, came at a cost. With every new edition of Les Prophéties, and with every layer of political interpretation, Nostradamus became more than a writer. He became a symbol. To some, he was a sage. To others, a dangerous mystic. His home was no longer merely a retreat, for study. It was a center of speculation. Visitors came not just for healing or wisdom, but for reassurance, fear, and answers to questions no man could truly resolve. In these final years, surrounded by manuscripts, charts, and the silent ticking of astrolabes and planetary clocks, Nostradamus worked with the urgency of a man who knew time was short. He refined his verses, encrypted new ones, and prepared his family for the legacy he would leave behind. He was no longer simply the physician of Salon de Provence. He had become the architect of a literary phenomenon that would stretch centuries beyond his lifetime, a phenomenon that blurred the boundaries between science and superstition, poetry and prophecy, history and imagination. In final years and death, 1566. By early 1566, Michel de Nostradam's health had declined significantly. He suffered from advanced gout, a condition that had plagued him intermittently for years but now left him nearly immobilized. The swelling in his joints had worsened, and his legs became edematous, a sign of fluid accumulation caused by a failing cardiovascular system. What had once been a manageable affliction now progressed into symptoms consistent with congestive heart failure, and by the spring of that year, Nostradamus was physically exhausted, though still mentally alert. Despite the pain, he continued to write and correspond. He worked on final revisions to Les Prophéties and dictated letters to trusted aides and family members. Some reports suggest he gave private consultations until just weeks before his death. He had already begun arranging the preservation of his manuscripts, aware that his name and his words would live on. His son César, the most literate and scholarly of his children, would later assist in organizing and posthumously publishing several works, ensuring their survival into future centuries. Nostradamus's final recorded prediction concerned his own death. According to tradition, he reportedly told his secretary, Jean de Chavigny, on the evening of July 1st, 1566, "You will not find me alive at sunrise." True to his word, he was discovered dead the next morning. The cause of death was not officially recorded, but was almost certainly due to complications from heart failure. He died in his study in the town of Salon de Provence, surrounded by the books, charts, and instruments that had shaped his life. He was 62 years old. At the time of his death, he was one of the most famous intellectuals in France, a man known not only for his prophecies, but also for his contributions to medicine, his wide correspondence with other thinkers, and his role as an advisor to royalty. Nostradamus had left instructions for his burial to be unconventional. He requested to be entombed upright in the Church of the Cordeliers in Salon, a Franciscan establishment whose cloister and chapel were among the most prominent religious sites in the town. The vertical burial was likely symbolic, perhaps a statement of vigilance in death, or a way to deter grave robbers. But it was also unusual enough to draw attention. His epitaph was written in Latin and included references to his work as a physician and astrologer of incomparable fame. During the French Revolution, 2 centuries after his death, anti-clerical forces desecrated the church where he was buried. The tomb was opened by soldiers, and legend claims that a medallion was discovered bearing the exact date of the exhumation, another eerie proof of prophecy in the eyes of his supporters. Some accounts claim that one soldier who touched the remains died shortly afterward, fueling further mythologization of Nostradamus's powers and the supposed curses surrounding his legacy. The destruction of the Church of the Cordeliers in the Revolutionary era was part of a broader movement against monarchy, religion, and symbols of the past. Nostradamus, however, escaped the fate of many forgotten thinkers. His name endured. His bones were eventually reinterred, and the site where he lived and worked in Salon de Provence became a place of pilgrimage for admirers, skeptics, and scholars alike. At the moment of his death, Nostradamus left behind far more than a stack of manuscripts. He left behind a mystique, a synthesis of intellect, mystery, discipline, and enigma. He had lived through one of the most volatile periods in French history, from the Italian Wars through the rise of religious extremism, and he had managed to build a bridge between empirical science and metaphysical speculation. His quatrains would continue to echo through the centuries, applied, accurately or not, to events he could never have imagined: the French Revolution, the World Wars, the space age, terrorism, and beyond. Even in death, Nostradamus resisted simplification. He was neither a prophet in the religious sense nor a charlatan. He had not claimed divine inspiration, nor had he professed infallibility. He was a man driven by a belief in cycles, signs, and the enduring human desire to understand what lies ahead. His writings, obscure and poetic, were both a mirror of his age and a window into the future, not because they foretold specific events, but because they reflected the recurring anxieties, ambitions, and failures of humanity itself. In the last chapter of his life, Michel de Nostredame passed quietly from this world, but his voice, crafted in verse, preserved through ink and paper, would continue to speak, interpreted and reinterpreted by generations to come. His death marked the end of a life lived at the crossroads of knowledge and mystery, but the beginning of a legend that would resist time itself. 10. Legacy and enduring influence. Posthumous. After his death, Nostradamus's influence only grew. While he had been a respected figure during his lifetime, particularly in the courts of France and among a niche audience of scholars, astrologers, and physicians, his posthumous fame expanded across continents and centuries. Les Prophéties, first printed in 1555 and expanded in 1558 and 1568, never went out of circulation for long. By the late 16th century, the book had been translated into multiple languages, including English, German, and Italian. It found readers across Europe, especially during periods of political unrest, religious turmoil, or natural catastrophe, when the public turned to prophecy for meaning and guidance. The 17th and 18th centuries saw a surge in interest in his work. During times of upheaval such as the 30 Years' War and the English Civil War, monarchists, revolutionaries, mystics, and common citizens alike found ways to interpret his verses as reflections or warnings about their time. This adaptability became one of the key features of Nostradamus's legacy. His cryptic and layered language enabled readers to project their own anxieties and hopes onto his prophecies. His work became, in effect, a literary Rorschach test. During the French Revolution, when institutions of monarchy and church were violently dismantled, Nostradamus's name resurfaced again. Revolutionaries claimed that his quatrains had predicted the fall of the Bourbon dynasty and the rise of a new order. Others insisted that he had warned of the dangers of secular tyranny. The ambiguity of his verses made it possible for opposing factions to claim his support. This dual-use function, foreseeing both catastrophe and redemption, has ensured his relevance across a wide spectrum of ideologies. The 19th century, especially in France, saw Nostradamus elevated to a near-mythical figure. Romantic writers and occultists were fascinated by him. He was featured in novels, stage plays, and philosophical treatises. His work influenced esoteric groups such as the Rosicrucians and Freemasons, who saw in his writings evidence of secret wisdom and ancient truths. Scholars, meanwhile, debated his methods, attempting to trace the sources of his references and the structure of his historical models. Some regarded him as a brilliant historian who cleverly repackaged classical motifs. Others saw him as a mystic, caught between worlds, half scientist, half oracle. In the 20th century, Nostradamus entered the realm of mass media. His quatrains were cited in books, radio broadcasts, and newspaper columns, often during or in the aftermath of major global events. During World War II, both Allied and Axis propaganda departments manipulated his writings to support their causes. In Nazi Germany, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda distributed leaflets that interpreted Nostradamus' verses to show a German victory. The Allies responded with their own leaflets, claiming he had predicted Hitler's downfall. After 1945, interest in Nostradamus surged in the United States. As the Cold War intensified and nuclear annihilation became a tangible fear, American publishers released dozens of books purporting to decode the quatrains. These texts often sold millions of copies. Writers like Erica Cheatham and Jean-Charles de Fontbrun popularized the idea that Nostradamus had foreseen the rise of totalitarianism. The assassination of John F. Kennedy, the fall of the Soviet Union, and global terrorism. The events of September 11, 2001, marked another peak in Nostradamus's popularity. In the days following the attacks, websites, television shows, and email chains spread fabricated quatrains that purportedly predicted the tragedy. Although most of these were proven to be modern inventions, often written in contemporary English and lacking any correlation to the original French verses, the public appetite for mystical explanation was undeniable. Nostradamus was once again cast as the prophet of disaster, a role that has followed him through centuries. In popular culture, he became an icon. Documentaries on networks like the History Channel and National Geographic devoted hours of programming to his life and works, often with dramatized readings of his quatrains accompanied by ominous music and apocalyptic imagery. His name appeared in comic books, songs, and films. He was referenced in The Simpsons, Doctor Who, and even video games, where his legacy as a mysterious predictor of doom became a narrative trope. Despite his fame, Nostradamus has remained a controversial figure. In academic circles, scholars continue to debate the originality and intent of his work. Some assert that his prophecies were based largely on ancient chronicles and rearranged historical events, dressed in poetic language to give the illusion of foresight. Others defend his methodology, noting his deep knowledge of astrology, history, and symbolic systems. Still others place him within the broader intellectual landscape of Renaissance Europe, neither a fraud nor a prophet, but a hybrid thinker shaped by the philosophical currents of his age. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his legacy is its endurance. Nostradamus's name is still invoked today, on social media, in podcasts, in news headlines, every time a new crisis emerges. Whether it is a war, a pandemic, a climate catastrophe, or political instability, people return to his quatrains in search of meaning. His writing taps into a universal desire, the wish to understand what lies ahead, to impose order on chaos, to believe that someone, somewhere, has already seen the future and left behind a map. More than 450 years after his death, Michel de Nostradam's words remain in circulation, translated into dozens of languages, quoted, analyzed, distorted, and revered. His blend of science, mysticism, history, and art created a body of work that refuses to fade. He exists in the public imagination, not as a man of his time, but as a timeless figure, whose visions continue to haunt the edges of possibility. The endurance of his influence is not proof of supernatural power, but of the lasting power of narrative. Nostradamus understood that people fear uncertainty more than anything, and he offered them a mirror in which they could glimpse their hopes and fears projected onto the stars. His legacy is not just the book he wrote, but the questions he forced us to ask. Can the future be known? And if it can, do we want to know it? 11. Methods and tools of prophecy. To understand why Nostradamus's prophecies have endured for centuries, one must examine how he created them. His methods were not rooted in divine revelation or spontaneous visions, as some later mystics claimed. Instead, they were the result of careful synthesis, drawing from history, astrology, symbolism, and the esoteric sciences of the Renaissance. He was not a prophet in the biblical sense, but a Renaissance intellectual, applying every resource available to uncover what he believed were patterns in time. The cornerstone of Nostradamus's method was astrology. In the 16th century, astrology was not yet divorced from astronomy. It was a serious discipline studied at universities, used by doctors to determine the best times for treatment, and consulted by monarchs to guide political decisions. Nostradamus charted planetary movements with precision, using astronomical tables that included data from Ptolemy and more contemporary sources like Regiomontanus and Al-Battani. These tables allowed him to track planetary conjunctions, eclipses, and retrogrades, which he interpreted as indicators of earthly change. He believed in a doctrine of cosmic sympathy, that celestial events influenced terrestrial affairs. This was not a fringe belief in his time. The Renaissance worldview was still steeped in the idea of macrocosm and microcosm, that the structure of the universe was mirrored in human life. When Saturn and Jupiter aligned, or Mars transited into opposition with Venus, Nostradamus read those movements not as random astronomical phenomena, but as celestial messages encoded in the fabric of time. But he didn't stop with planetary charts. He layered in his knowledge of historical cycles. Nostradamus believed that history moved in repeating patterns, and that by studying past events, one could forecast future outcomes. This cyclical view of history was influenced by classical thinkers like Livy and Tacitus, as well as Jewish and Christian apocalyptic texts, particularly the Book of Daniel and the Book of Revelation. He believed that great empires rose and fell according to divine rhythms, that kings and tyrants appeared in predictable sequences, and that humanity followed archetypal paths again and again. To augment these frameworks, Nostradamus used a technique known as scrying. This practice, rooted in ancient traditions, involved entering a trance state while gazing into a reflective surface, such as a bowl of water, a mirror made of obsidian, or a polished brass plate. In this altered state of consciousness, the practitioner would receive symbolic visions, often fragmented or metaphorical. There are accounts, including some from his son Caesar, that Nostradamus employed this technique in a darkened chamber, lit only by a single candle, in the silence of the early morning hours. He described these visions as coming like flames from the ashes, filled with images he would later translate into poetic form. The use of multiple languages in his quatrains, French, Latin, Greek, and Provençal, was not accidental. Each language carried symbolic weight and allowed for layers of meaning. Latin added gravitas and historical resonance. Greek invoked philosophical and scientific authority. Provençal connected his work to the cultural heritage of southern France. He frequently employed anagrams, word inversions, and obscure mythological references to conceal meanings. This opacity protected him from accusations of heresy and gave his readers the intellectual pleasure of decoding riddles. He also employed numerology, assigning symbolic values to numbers and dates. Certain numbers, like 7, 10, and 1000, held special meaning and appeared repeatedly in his work. He calculated astrological charts not only for individuals like Catherine de' Medici and her children, but also for entire nations and cities. His calculations of great years, long-term cycles that supposedly governed the rise and fall of civilizations, drew from traditions going back to Zoroastrian cosmology and Platonic time theory. What makes Nostradamus's methodology particularly unique is the combination of empirical rigor and symbolic imagination. He did not rely solely on faith, nor did he trust observation alone. He moved between worlds, science and art, reason and intuition, history and divination, using each as a lens to refract his view of the future. In a time when disciplinary boundaries were still forming, this interdisciplinarity was not only acceptable, it was expected of the learned. His critics, then and now, often accuse him of vagueness. And it's true, the language of the quatrains is elusive, filled with metaphor and ambiguity. But this was by design. Nostradamus was not trying to offer specific instructions or fixed dates. He was instead crafting a symbolic framework through which readers could interpret events in their own time. By leaving his prophecies open-ended, he allowed them to adapt and persist across generations. This methodological ambiguity also helped Les Prophéties survive at times when stricter or more explicit prophetic works were banned or burned. Nostradamus's refusal to name names or fix dates gave his work the flexibility to navigate periods of censorship, doctrinal scrutiny, and political repression. In the modern era, his techniques may seem arcane or unscientific, but within the intellectual landscape of the 16th century, they represented a synthesis of the best available knowledge. from astronomy to history, from medicine to metaphysics. His tools were the instruments of a polymath, his methods the blueprint of someone who refused to accept the boundaries of conventional thought. More than 4 centuries later, the instruments Nostradamus used, astrolabes, water bowls, ancient texts, are preserved in museums and private collections. But his true tool, the one that made all the others effective, was his mind, curious, disciplined, imaginative, and unafraid to look into the abyss of time and return with something resembling truth, or at least the shadow of it. 12. Criticism, controversy, and modern reception. From the moment Les Prophéties appeared in print, Nostradamus found himself at the center of debate. Even during his lifetime, his writings were subject to scrutiny, suspicion, and at times fierce opposition. Clergy, scholars, and political figures disagreed not only about the meaning of his verses, but about whether they were worth reading at all. To some, he was a man blessed with insight. To others, a charlatan cloaked in poetry and mysticism. The most enduring criticism of Nostradamus has always centered on the vagueness of his language. His quatrains are famously difficult to interpret, lacking precise dates, clear geographic markers, or named individuals. Critics argue that this ambiguity allows his verses to be retrofitted to nearly any historical event. This phenomenon, known in modern psychology as retrofitting or confirmation bias, is when people read past events into vague predictions and then regard those predictions as evidence of foresight. In Nostradamus's case, entire books have been written connecting his verses to everything from the Great Fire of London in 1666 to the attacks of September 11, 2001. His defenders counter this critique by emphasizing the deliberate nature of his poetic construction. They argue that Nostradamus wrote in coded language to protect himself from political retaliation and religious persecution. To name a monarch or predict the fall of a kingdom in plain language could have led to his imprisonment, or worse. Supporters also claim that the symbolic nature of his writing reflects a deeper truth, that the future cannot be seen as a fixed chain of events, but only glimpsed through patterns and metaphors. In this reading, his use of allegory was not a trick, but a necessity. The controversy surrounding Nostradamus intensified during moments of crisis. In the 20th century, as new global threats emerged, fascism, nuclear war, terrorism, interpreters of Nostradamus's writings published increasingly elaborate analyses linking his quatrains to modern events. Authors like Erika Cheetham popularized the idea that Nostradamus foresaw the rise of Adolf Hitler, linked to the term Hister. In Century 2, Quatrain 24, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and even space exploration. These interpretations made Nostradamus a household name in America during the Cold War, particularly in the 1980s, when televised documentaries brought his work to audiences of millions. However, these modern interpretations often lacked scholarly rigor. Many were based on mistranslations, selective reading, or speculative logic. For example, some English editions of Les Prophéties introduced changes to the original French to better match contemporary events. Others took unrelated quatrains and rearranged them into linear narratives to create the illusion of prediction. This manipulation of texts for sensationalist purposes created an entire industry of Nostradamus experts and fueled public fascination. But it also distorted the historical and literary value of his original work. Nostradamus also became a figure of satire and parody. Popular culture embraced him not only as a prophet, but as a symbol of pseudo-wisdom and gullibility. Cartoons, late-night shows, and comic books depicted him as a bearded fortune-teller with a crystal ball, perpetuating a caricature that bore little resemblance to the historical man. Yet even these portrayals helped keep his name in circulation, turning him into a cultural touchstone known far beyond academic or occult circles. In scholarly settings, Nostradamus occupies a more complex position. Historians of science and literature recognize him as a representative figure of the Renaissance, a man whose life and work reflected the era's merging of empirical investigation and mystical speculation. Researchers studying early modern cosmology, textual ambiguity, and the psychology of belief often cite him in broader discussions about prophecy, symbolic language, and the human desire to find meaning in uncertainty. Moreover, linguists and literary scholars have analyzed the structure of his quatrains, pointing out the techniques he used to encode ideas: enjambment, repetition, allusion, and anaphora. These studies view Les Prophéties not merely as prophetic literature, but as a complex work of art, influenced by medieval poetic forms, biblical psalmody, and classical epic traditions. His style, far from being accidental or chaotic, reflects a deliberate and skilled use of language that aligns with the rhetorical standards of his time. Even the notion of prediction has been reevaluated. Some modern interpreters suggest that Nostradamus did not see the future in a literal sense, but identified deep historical patterns, cycles of power, corruption, war, and renewal that repeat in different guises across centuries. This interpretation aligns him more with historians or political theorists than with clairvoyants. It positions him as a man who understood the nature of change, decay, and transformation, rather than someone who saw specific future headlines. In recent decades, the internet has both amplified and complicated his reception. Online platforms have enabled rapid dissemination of false quatrains, verses entirely fabricated and attributed to Nostradamus, to exploit current fears. Social media, especially during crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic or major natural disasters, is often flooded with memes and posts claiming that Nostradamus predicted it all. These viral fabrications dilute the authenticity of his actual writings and further blur the line between myth and reality. Despite all this, or perhaps because of it, Nostradamus remains one of the most recognized historical figures in the Western world. His name evokes mystery, uncertainty, and the possibility that the future is not wholly unknowable. He continues to be read, debated, reimagined, and misquoted. His quatrains are carved into monuments, studied in universities, and recited in popular media. His legacy is no longer just about the predictions he may or may not have made. It is about the role he continues to play in the collective imagination. Ultimately, the controversy that surrounds Nostradamus is not a weakness of his legacy. It is its engine. He was never meant to be fully understood, never meant to provide certainty. His greatness lies in the tension he created between knowledge and mystery, language and silence, history and possibility. That is why he endures, not as a prophet who told the future, but as a poet who made us question what we believe we know about it. 13. The scientific and rationalist view modern science has little patience for prophecy. In the age of evidence-based research, statistical modeling, and the scientific method, Nostradamus's legacy is often viewed with skepticism, if not outright dismissal. From the standpoint of rationalist critique, his quatrains are considered too vague, too metaphorical, and too malleable to constitute genuine predictions. Instead of precise forecasts, they are seen as linguistic artifacts, texts that acquire meaning only in hindsight, never through verifiable foresight. Contemporary historians and scientists place Nostradamus squarely within the intellectual framework of the 16th century, a period marked by both an explosion of knowledge and a lingering dependence on mysticism. The Renaissance was a transitional era. While it gave rise to new methods of inquiry, such as the empirical experimentation that would define the scientific revolution, it also retained much of the medieval worldview. Astrology, alchemy, numerology, and magical cosmology were still part of mainstream intellectual life. Within this context, Nostradamus was not an outlier, but a product of his time. He practiced medicine at a time when physicians still used astrology to determine the best days for surgery and herbal treatments. The idea that celestial bodies could influence human health, personality, and fate was not controversial. It was orthodoxy. University-trained doctors were expected to know astrology alongside anatomy. To critique Nostradamus today for using these methods is to overlook the epistemological landscape of the Renaissance. What we now call pseudoscience was then seen as part of the natural order of things. Still, even by the standards of his time, Nostradamus took a more poetic and less technical approach to astrology than many of his contemporaries. He rarely included specific horoscopes or astrological charts in Les Prophéties. His work was not designed to meet the standards of scientific astrology as practiced by professionals in court or academia. Instead, he used celestial symbolism as a narrative device, evoking planetary alignments and eclipses not for their mathematical precision, but for their metaphorical resonance. This blurring of science and art is a central reason why many modern scientists dismiss his work. It does not conform to replicable systems or falsifiable claims. Philosophers and cognitive scientists also point out how the structure of Nostradamus's writing engages basic psychological tendencies. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We are drawn to stories, metaphors, and frameworks that help us make sense of uncertainty. In times of fear or crisis, we look for signs that someone, somewhere, knew this was coming. Nostradamus's quatrains, with their dreamlike images and flexible syntax, offer fertile ground for this type of psychological projection. The concept of the Barnum effect is frequently used to explain the appeal of Nostradamus. Named after P.T. Barnum, it refers to the human tendency to interpret vague and general statements as highly accurate for themselves personally. Because the language is so open-ended, it could apply to almost anyone. Nostradamus's prophecies function similarly. A phrase like, "the great man will fall in the west during darkened skies," could be interpreted to fit dozens of historical events, depending on how generously one reads into the metaphor. Yet, even with all this criticism, some rationalists find value in studying Nostradamus, not as a seer, but as a cultural phenomenon. His work illustrates how knowledge systems evolve, how societies construct meaning, and how uncertainty is managed through narrative. He becomes a case study in the transition from mystical to empirical worldviews. He offers insight into the epistemology of the Renaissance, a world where astrology was science, where history was cyclical, and where poetry was a form of coded truth. In recent years, interdisciplinary scholars have begun to reevaluate Nostradamus in this light. Rather than asking, "Was he right?" they ask, "What did people need him to be right about?" The answer varies. During plague years, he represented a kind of magical doctor. During wars, he was a prophet of warning. During times of peace, he became a literary curiosity or even an object of satire. The meaning of Nostradamus, then, is shaped less by the accuracy of his verses and more by the context in which they are read. Some scientists and historians have also drawn parallels between Nostradamus's work and modern predictive models, not to validate his claims, but to understand the psychology behind forecasting. In a world driven by algorithms, simulations, and economic projections, the desire to anticipate the future has only grown stronger. Nostradamus tapped into that same need centuries earlier, using the tools available to him, celestial charts, historical patterns, poetic language, to construct a framework for thinking about time. This does not mean his work stands up to modern scientific scrutiny. It does not. The methodology lacks rigor, the conclusions are not testable, and the predictions are not specific enough to be verified or falsified. But that is not the point. Nostradamus was not trying to do science in the 21st century sense of the word. He was engaging in a different kind of knowledge production, one that was as much about intuition, metaphor, and myth as it was about observation. From a rationalist perspective, Nostradamus is best understood not as a prophet, but as a mirror. He reflects the fears, hopes, and intellectual frameworks of those who read him. He offers a vocabulary for uncertainty, a poetic structure through which to process the unknown. And while he may not have predicted the future in any quantifiable way, he anticipated something far more enduring: the human compulsion to look beyond the present, to search the stars, and to find in the swirling chaos of history a sign that it all might mean something. In this way, even the most skeptical scientist can find in Nostradamus a figure worth studying, not for what he foresaw, but for what he reveals about the culture that produced him and the cultures that continue to keep his memory alive. 14. Nostradamus and the Digital Age. In the 21st century, Nostradamus entered yet another phase of cultural relevance, this time in the digital sphere. The age of the internet, social media, and rapid information exchange has magnified both the reach and distortion of his work. His name now circulates across platforms like TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, and Reddit, often attached to contemporary fears: pandemics, climate disasters, artificial intelligence, nuclear conflict, or economic collapse. Nostradamus has become an algorithmic prophet, his verses resurrected, reinterpreted, and repackaged at the speed of viral content. This modern resurgence did not begin with digital technology, but the internet has accelerated and globalized it. In the early 2000s, following the attacks on September 11th, fabricated quatrains falsely attributed to Nostradamus spread through email chains and early blogs. These verses, often written in plain English and bearing none of his stylistic features, were quickly debunked by historians and linguists. Still, their impact was profound. Millions of people read them, many believed them, and Nostradamus's name was once again cemented in the popular imagination as a seer who had somehow seen everything. With the rise of social media, the phenomenon intensified. On platforms driven by brevity and emotional engagement, Nostradamus's actual writings were rarely cited in full or context. Instead, they were reduced to headlines, memes, or sensationalist claims. Nostradamus predicted COVID-19. Nostradamus foresaw the war in Ukraine, or Nostradamus warned us about AI, are examples of recurring trends, statements shared thousands of times, often without sources or verification. Most of these claims originate from misinterpretations, loose paraphrasing, or complete fabrications. Nevertheless, their popularity reveals a deep truth. In a world defined by rapid change, instability, and constant exposure to global crises, people continue to seek patterns and foreknowledge. Nostradamus offers a kind of symbolic comfort, a historical figure whose supposed insight suggests that chaos may be part of a larger, comprehensible design. The appeal is not in the specifics, but in the implication that someone, somewhere, already knew what would happen. Streaming platforms have also revived interest in Nostradamus. Documentaries and dramatizations, often using ominous music, digitally aged parchment, and reenactments, present his life and writings as mysterious puzzles waiting to be solved. While some productions strive for historical accuracy, many prioritize entertainment, blending fact and fiction to create suspenseful narratives. These portrayals frequently omit the nuances of his intellectual context, the layered nature of his language, and the methodological caution with which he approached his work. Even artificial intelligence has been drawn into the orbit of Nostradamus. Some online users have prompted chatbots and language models to generate new quatrains in the style of Nostradamus, combining old forms with new tools. These AI-generated verses often mimic the ambiguity and imagery of the originals, but are entirely fictional. They are sometimes labeled clearly as creative exercises, but just as often they're misrepresented as real. This fusion of historical content with emerging technology reflects how Nostradamus continues to evolve, not as a static legacy, but as a living artifact reshaped by each new generation. Another digital age challenge is the difficulty of verifying authenticity. Most readers engaging with Nostradamus online do not consult 16th century French editions of Les Prophéties, nor do they analyze the historical context of each quatrain. Instead, they encounter his name through filtered, abbreviated, and sometimes manipulated sources. Scholars have attempted to correct the record through annotated editions, academic articles, and public commentary. But the sheer volume of misinformation makes accurate understanding a constant uphill battle. Ironically, This chaos mirrors the structure of the quatrains themselves, fragmented, non-linear, open to multiple interpretations. Nostradamus, who carefully concealed his meanings with metaphor, would perhaps recognize the fluid, unstable life of his writings in the digital realm. The internet has not clarified his message, it has amplified its multiplicity. Yet within this confusion lies an opportunity. Digital archives and online scholarship have made his original texts more accessible than ever before. High-resolution scans of his earliest editions are available through national libraries. Scholars have published translations and commentaries that clarify linguistic ambiguities and historical references. The same technologies that spread misinformation can, when used carefully, bring deeper understanding. Educators and historians now face the task of helping modern audiences navigate the digital Nostradamus. By framing his work within its historical context, explaining Renaissance astrology, poetic convention, and the political realities of 16th century France, readers can begin to see him not as a prophet of doom, but as a complex thinker responding to the uncertainties of his time. The digital age has not diminished Nostradamus, it has reanimated him. He lives not only in books or academic journals, but in hashtags, search results, and live streams. He is invoked during election cycles, international conflicts, and natural disasters. His name, stripped of punctuation and nuance, scrolls past on feeds and comment sections, often reduced to shorthand for "someone warned us." In this era of deepfakes, disinformation, and fragmented truth, Nostradamus continues to embody the tension between knowledge and speculation, clarity and mystery. He stands as a reminder that history does not move in straight lines, that language can obscure as much as it reveals, and that the human desire to know the future remains as powerful and as perilous as ever. 15. The House in Salon and His Writings. Today, the town of Salon de Provence holds a unique place in the legacy of Nostradamus. Nestled in the heart of southern France, Salon is not merely a backdrop to his final years. It is a living monument to his life, his work, and the centuries-long fascination that continues to surround him. His former residence on Rue Notre Dame has been preserved and transformed into a museum, Maison de Nostradamus. This modest stone house, with its 16th century architecture intact, now serves as a cultural site where visitors can walk through reconstructed rooms, view period instruments, and engage with multimedia presentations about his life and legacy. The museum contains replicas of his astrological tools, armillary spheres, astrolabes, water clocks, as well as bookshelves filled with works similar to those he would have owned, volumes on astrology, medicine, alchemy, and ancient philosophy. Letters, diagrams, and manuscript pages are displayed behind glass, contextualized by descriptions in French and English. Visitors are guided through his dual identity as both a physician and prophet, highlighting his role in Renaissance intellectual culture. One room features an immersive timeline of Les Prophéties, including major world events that have been retroactively linked to his quatrains. Salon has embraced its most famous resident as a symbol of the town's historical and cultural identity. Street names, public spaces, and local businesses bear his name. Statues and plaques commemorate his influence. Every summer, the town hosts events dedicated to his life, lectures, reenactments, and festivals that draw both academics and the merely curious. For the residents of Salon, Nostradamus is not just a historical figure, but a continuing presence, woven into the fabric of daily life. Outside of Salon, Nostradamus's writings remain widely available. New editions of Les Prophéties are published each year in numerous languages. Academic publishers release critical editions that seek to restore the original French and clarify centuries of copyist errors, interpolations, and mistranslations. These versions include footnotes that identify historical references, unpack linguistic puzzles, and explain the astrological configurations mentioned in the text. Some of the most respected editions are produced by French scholars, working with institutions like the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Digital humanities projects have made significant strides in preserving and disseminating Nostradamus's work. Several universities and libraries have digitized early editions of Les Prophéties, making them freely accessible to scholars and the public. These scans allow for side-by-side comparison of different printings, revealing how the text evolved through various editions. In some cases, handwritten marginalia by early readers provide insight into how Nostradamus's work was interpreted shortly after publication. Academic interest in Nostradamus extends beyond his prophetic content. Scholars study his writings through various lenses: literary theory, history of science, religious studies, and political philosophy. His quatrains are examined not only as predictive texts, but as examples of Renaissance literature, complex, intertextual, and shaped by classical models. Researchers investigate his sources, trace the genealogy of specific phrases, and explore how his worldview intersected with the philosophical and theological debates of his time. At the same time, less formal interpretations continue to flourish. Online forums, social media groups, and self-published books offer countless readings of Nostradamus's quatrains, often tying them to current events. Many of these interpretations are speculative, imaginative, or simply incorrect. However, they serve an important cultural function. They show how people across cultures and eras continue to use Nostradamus's work as a framework for understanding uncertainty, a tool for making sense of the world when traditional explanations fail. In C, the classroom, Nostradamus is sometimes introduced as a bridge between disciplines. History teachers use him to discuss the intellectual landscape of the Renaissance. Literature instructors explore his poetic structure and use of language. In courses on critical thinking or media literacy, his work provides a compelling case study in confirmation bias, interpretive flexibility, and the construction of belief. He functions as a multidisciplinary figure who offers a touchpoint for discussion across fields. His influence is also felt in fiction. Novelists, screenwriters, and game designers have drawn inspiration from his life and writings. He appears in thrillers as a cryptic sage, in science fiction as a visionary, in historical dramas as a man navigating danger through coded verse. These portrayals vary in accuracy, but they reflect the power of Nostradamus as a narrative archetype, the wise outsider who sees what others cannot. Despite the wide range of interpretations, Nostradamus's original intent remains elusive. He never published a clear explanation of his method. He did not claim divine revelation. He offered no singular vision of the future. What he left behind was a body of poetic fragments, suggestive, haunting, often beautiful, that resist final interpretation. His house in Salon, his books in libraries, and his name in public discourse are not monuments to certainty, but to mystery. And yet, this very ambiguity is the reason his work continues to live. Les Prophéties was not written for one moment or one nation. It was crafted to endure. Its language was made to shift with time, to speak differently to each reader in each era. In Salon, his footsteps linger. In print, his verses still whisper. In classrooms, archives, theaters, and digital screens, the words of Nostradamus keep moving, ever open, ever alive. 16. Conclusion of the life story. In the final year of his life, 1566, Michel de Nostradame remained in Salon de Provence, his health failing but his mind as active as ever. He was deeply engaged in writing, revising, and organizing the last editions. To his life's work, the symptoms of his worsening gout, intense joint inflammation, swelling, and limited mobility, had by then become chronic and debilitating. His legs retained fluid, a sign of congestive heart failure, and his doctors likely recognized that his time was short. Yet, Nostradamus continued to maintain correspondence, receive visitors, and prepare his manuscripts for preservation. Among his final labors was the consolidation of his prophetic verses. By the time of his death, he had written 942 quatrains, organized into centuries, a structure that was not chronological but numerological. reflecting his belief in cyclical time and symbolic mathematics. The 10th century was left incomplete, with only 42 quatrains instead of the usual 100, suggesting either that he had intended to write more, or that he died before completing the set. He left notes and prefaces in prose that provided vague insight into his intentions, but true to form, he remained elusive about method and meaning. As death approached, Nostradamus reportedly issued his final forecast, predicting to his assistant, Jean de Chavigny, that he would be found dead by morning. The next day, on July 2, 1566, he was discovered lifeless in his study, seated or possibly laid beside his work, exactly as he had foretold. He was 62 years old. Nostradamus had made arrangements for his burial to be carried out in an unusual fashion. He requested to be buried upright beneath a wall of the Church of the Cordeliers in Salon. This rare form of interment may have symbolized his desire to remain watchful even in death, or perhaps it was intended as a deterrent to grave robbers or desecration, both real threats during periods of religious and political unrest. A Latin epitaph was inscribed on his tomb, briefly summarizing his identity and legacy, and noting that his son César had fulfilled the burial request. His interment did not go undisturbed. In 1791, during the French Revolution, radical troops opened his tomb during an anti-clerical raid. Revolutionary zeal had targeted churches and tombs throughout the country, viewing them as symbols of monarchy and ecclesiastical corruption. Legend holds that a medallion was found on his body bearing the date of the exhumation, a detail that circulated widely in popular accounts and was later used to further embellish his legend. Other tales claimed that a soldier who touched his remains died soon afterward, a curse invoked by those who believed his power extended beyond the grave. After his death, his family remained in Salon. His son César, also a writer and historian, worked to preserve his father's legacy, publishing edited volumes of his texts and defending the integrity of his methods. In the decades that followed, Nostradamus's reputation grew far beyond the borders of Provence. His writings were copied, translated, and interpreted across Europe and eventually around the world. He became, in death, more influential than he had ever been in life. At the time of his passing, France was already descending into deeper religious conflict. The wars of religion, which had simmered for decades, would soon explode into full-scale civil war between Catholics and Huguenots. Nostradamus's avoidance of overt political alignment had protected him during life, but his writings were inevitably pulled into the ideological battles of the era. Opposing sides sought support for their causes within his quatrains, interpreting his verses through the lens of their own hopes, fears, and agendas. Meanwhile, the broader European landscape was entering a period of immense change. The Protestant Reformation was reshaping the religious map of the continent. Scientific inquiry was beginning to challenge older cosmologies. Political power was shifting among monarchies, empires, and emerging nation-states. Amid this turbulence, Nostradamus's vision, fluid, symbolic, and haunting, remained compelling. His prophecies did not provide certainty, but they echoed the disquiet of a world in transition. His legacy moved outward, expanding in tandem with the forces of print culture, intellectual curiosity, and spiritual longing. His name, once associated with plague cures and astrological charts, became a cipher for something much larger, a quest to glimpse the shape of things to come. In his cryptic verses, generations have sought patterns that explain the present and illuminate the future. Michel de Nostradamus, died as he lived, a man caught between disciplines, between faith and reason, between poetry and history. His writings continued to circulate not just because they foretold the future, but because they engaged so powerfully with the deepest fears and aspirations of the human experience. His life ended in a small house in a provincial town, but the Yati story he began writing there never truly concluded. His words traveled onward, through centuries of change, forever waiting to be read again.